Okay, last time I opened up the whole issue of unconscious mental states, that is, representations of past or present experience that might influence our experience, thought, or action outside of phenomenal awareness and presumably outside of conscious control as well. And introduced the distinction between explicit and implicit memory as part of an argument that we do have things that you would be quite happy to call unconscious memories, in that priming effects take place where people don't have any conscious memory for the prime. By any standard, I think that counts as an unconscious memory. And what I want to do over the next couple of lectures is to expand this distinction between the explicit and the implicit beyond memory to other domains of cognition, and then to other domains of mental life, like emotion and especially motivation. But before I leave the topic of implicit memory, I want to make a couple points about the nature of this work so far. There, okay. The first is all the examples of priming that I showed you last time are what are called repetition priming, where there is a physical resemblance between the prime and the target. Somebody studies a word like ash can, and then they're asked to fill in a stem that starts with ASH. Okay? There's a physical resemblance between the prime and the target. Those kinds of repetition priming effects can be mediated by what's known as a perception-based representation of the prime. That is, a mental representation, a memory, if you will, or an image of the prime that preserves its physical characteristics, its physical appearance, its spatial configuration, its temporal relations with other kinds of things. These are all more or less physical properties of the stimulus. But there are other kinds of representations in memory as well, and these are of special interest for what's going to come today when we talk about implicit perception, because there are also meaning-based representations that might influence our behavior. And instead of representing the physical structure or the physical features of an event, they represent its significance, its meaning, its implications, its semantic relations with other kinds of objects and other kinds of events. And as I said before, the cases of priming that I showed you last time were all cases of repetition priming that can be based on a perceptual representation. What I haven't shown you yet are cases of semantic priming that require more by way of a representation. They require some kind of meaning-based, or we might call it propositional, based representation of the event. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. So, for example, in category priming, we might have a subject study a list of words that consist of all instances of a particular category, like trees, oak tree, oak, elm, whatever. Okay, oak, whatever kinds of trees there are. Oak, elm, pine, cedar, redwood, whatever. You just have a list of words like that. And then at the time of the test, you don't present those words, but you simply ask the person to generate instances of the broader category tree. Category priming occurs if a person is more likely to generate instances from the study list than other kinds of instances. Similarly, we have associative priming, where a subject might study a word like chair, and then instead of being given a stem like CHA to complete, what we do is present the person with a close associate like table and ask him to give us the first word that comes to mind. And if he gives chair, that's known as associative priming. And then finally, there are what you might call priming based on idiomatic associates, the kinds of things that are idioms in a particular language or perhaps in a particular dialect, like sour grapes. So I ask you to study a word like grapes, and then I give you the target, the cue sour, and ask you simply to complete that with an idiom. There's no physical resemblance between tree and oak, between table and chair, between sour and grapes. Whatever priming occurs has to be mediated by something that goes beyond a perceptual representation of the prime, but rather has to include the something about the semantic meaning or conceptual relations of the prime. So can you get semantic priming? Well, it turns out that there haven't been a lot of studies of semantic priming in implicit memory. The reasons for that, I think, are basically laziness on the part of the investigators. Repetition priming is a really easy the paradigm to use, and repetition priming has kind of captured the literature on implicit memory in a way that I think is unfortunate. But there are some examples of semantic priming, and I just want to show you this one. This is an old and good study by Gardner and his colleagues out of the Boston VA. And in this the study, amnesic patients, there were a bunch of them at the Boston VA at this time, and control patients studied a list of words that consisted of category instances, words like oak, fir, elm, redwood, gold, silver, bronze, platinum, arm, leg, hand, foot, okay? Then, after a little bit of a distraction interval, they were asked to recall those words, and what you can see is that the amnesic patients did very poorly. There was also a cued recall condition in which the subjects were given a list item and then asked to remember another item from the list. And the amnesic patients did that one pretty badly as well. But when they were simply asked to generate instances of categories, there was something, okay, just name all the trees, kinds of trees you can name, or name all the kinds of metals you can name, or name all the body parts that you can name. They were much more likely to produce category instances from the previously studied list than control subjects were. That looks small, but it's actually quite a substantial the priming effect in this literature. So again, you get category priming in these amnesic patients. They can't remember what the words that they studied, but they've got a memory for those words that influences their performance on a category generation task, and that priming effect has to be mediated by something other than a perception-based representation. It has to be mediated by some kind of semantic representation. That becomes important. All of this becomes important when we turn to the next topic in the explicit-implicit distinction. So let me make sure that we've got it here. Okay. First, any kind of test can be used to test for either perception-based priming or semantic or conceptually based priming. So, for example, in STEM completion, subject might study the word ashtray and then be asked to complete the STEM ASH. But you can turn that perceptual priming test into a conceptual priming test by changing the cue. The subject studies ashtray, and then we say, okay, cigarette, complete the word ASH. Okay, if they do that, then that priming effect is not being based on the physical relationship between the prime and the target, but rather by the conceptual relationship between the prime and the target. We'll go all the way down here. I won't go through all of them. You'll see some examples of this in a couple of moments. Okay, so just to kind of draw that to a close, the implication of all of this is that implicit memory is unconscious memory. It's memory of a past experience that influences the person's current experience, thought, and action in the absence of conscious recollection. That dissociation between implicit and explicit memory is critical to this argument. So now, having established to almost everybody's satisfaction, there are a couple of people out there who are being real jerks about this, but mostly the distinction between explicit and implicit memory is very well established in the psychological literature. And what we want to do now is to see if we can extend this distinction to other domains of mental life. And the first one is perception. Can we have unconscious percepts, implicit percepts, in the same way that we have unconscious implicit memories? So first, let's look at the relationship between implicit memory and what I'm going to call implicit perception. In implicit memory, we have an effect of a past experience on the person's current experience, thought, or action in the absence of conscious recollection of that past experience. The definition of implicit perception is exactly parallel to this. We have an effect of a current event, an event in the current stimulus environment that influences the person's experience, thought, or action in the absence of conscious perception of that event. Okay, so that's basically how these two definitions line up in parallel. You have to bear in mind what we mean by a past event. In psychology, a past event is anything that occurs prior to 30 seconds of distraction. Okay, that's a long-term memory. In psychology as well, a current event could be something that occurred a couple of seconds ago. Okay, it's what James called the specious present. That is, the present is always past for us. Whenever we think about the present, we're always thinking about something that happened about a millisecond ago. But there's this time, a period of time on the order of seconds that is, for all intents and purposes, the present. Okay, so let's start looking at implicit perception. This literature, again, goes way back to a question raised in the even as early as the 18th century about thresholds for perception. And a philosopher, Leibniz, argued that basically on logical grounds that conscious percepts have to be built up from something. And he argued that conscious percepts were built up from unconscious percepts, which he called petite perception. Pardon my French, which I don't speak. Okay? But that's basically how you pronounce it. Little percepts, okay, make big percepts. And you kind of see where that argument might come from. Jump forward about 100 years to a guy named Herbart who identified a concept in the study of sensation and perception known as the Lyman, or as we know it in English, the threshold for perception. Lyman simply is German for boundary or border. And right at the beginning of 19th century psychophysics, Herbart argued that there was a Lyman, or a threshold, of stimulus intensity below which you couldn't consciously perceive the stimulus. So that intensity had to go above this threshold in order for it to be available for conscious perception. We've seen that before when we talked about thresholds in the lectures on introspection. But Herbart took a kind of leaf from Leibniz's book and said, look, there are these unconscious percepts that are below the Lyman, below the threshold for conscious perception, but that these can still have an effect on consciousness. Unconscious, subliminal percepts can have an effect on conscious behavior. And then he went on to say, well, that's true for percepts, but it's also true for ideas, things that you just have rummaging around in your mind. A lot of 19th century psychophysics, and for that matter, a fair amount of 20th century psychophysics as well, was built around this idea and trying to figure out what the thresholds for perception were and all of that, as I talked about earlier. But some investigators began to raise the question of whether there really was any kind of threshold for conscious perception. And if so, if it was really true that unconscious percepts, subliminal percepts, could still influence a person's